In the divorce courtroom in Hamilton, Ontario, my husband of 31 years sat across from me and quietly laughed. Not a large laugh. Just a soft exhale through his nose, the sound he made whenever someone said something he found slightly beneath him. Frederick Carmody, founder of Carmody Property Services, leaned back in his chair and said to his lawyer in a voice just loud enough to carry, "She kept a few files. That's not a business contribution. That's filing." The room went still. For a moment, I thought that was it. That he had already won, not in any legal sense, but in the way that mattered more. He had said it aloud, and it had landed without challenge, and now everyone in the room would carry that version of events home with them. Then the door at the back of the courtroom opened, and Maurice Dubé walked in. Fred's lawyer stopped mid-sentence. Fred turned around, and I watched something happen to his face that I had not seen there in years. Genuine, unguarded surprise. The kind that doesn't have time to compose itself into something more useful. Maurice Dubé had kept the company's accounts for 22 years. He was the very last person Frederick Carmody had expected to see standing at the back of that courtroom, with a manila folder pressed against his chest. Before I tell you what came next, I want to ask you something. Have you ever given 30 years of your life to something? Truly given it, the way you give things when you've stopped keeping score, and then one day watched the person standing beside you claim all of it as his own? If that has ever happened to you, I think you already know how the body feels in a moment like that. Not angry, not yet. Just very, very quiet inside. My name is Edith Carmody, and I am 63 years old. I grew up in Hamilton, Ontario, which is not a glamorous city, but it is an honest one, and I have always thought that counted for something. I was working as a bookkeeper for a small construction firm when I met Fred at a fall fair in Dundas. The kind of weekend event where you eat too much kettle corn and end up staying 2 hours longer than you planned, because the person you met beside the apple butter stall turned out to be more interesting than anyone you'd spoken to in months. Fred was 34. I was 31. He had a warm laugh and a small notebook he kept in his back pocket, always jotting something down. Ideas, estimates, calculations. He wanted to start his own property maintenance company. Landscaping in the summers, snow clearing in the winters, commercial and residential contracts across the Hamilton area. He had the vision and the energy and the knowledge of the trade. What he didn't have yet was the credit history, the startup capital, or anyone to help him manage the paperwork. He proposed at Christmas, 7 months after we met. I said yes without hesitating, and I meant it without a single reservation. The early years were genuinely hard. Not the softened, fondly remembered version of hard. The kind where you check your bank balance before you buy groceries, where the truck breaks down in February, and you lie awake for 2 nights, because you don't know how you'll cover the repair, and still make payroll for the 2 men counting on you to do it. Fred's parents were modest, working people who had left very little behind. Mine were the same. We had no investors, no family money, nothing to fall back on except each other and our own willingness to keep going. The loan that started Carmody Property Services was approved on a single condition. Our bank manager, a careful man who had watched too many small businesses in the trades collapse in their first 2 years, reviewed Fred's projections and then looked across the desk at me. He said the numbers weren't quite enough on their own. He said if I was willing to co-sign and personally guarantee the loan, to put my own credit history and financial future behind it, he could work with us. Fred shook his head right away. He didn't want me carrying that risk. I signed the documents anyway, across 12 separate pages. At the time, I didn't think of it as a sacrifice. It felt like what you did for the person you loved, when what he needed was a partner who actually believed in what he was building. For the years that followed, while Fred ran the crews and developed the client relationships, I managed nearly everything else, not because I was asked to. There was simply no one else to do it. Invoicing, accounts payable, payroll, tax filings, crew schedules, equipment maintenance records, insurance renewals, correspondence with suppliers, applications for municipal contracts. I did it in the evenings after my own full-time job, on Saturday mornings, while Fred was on sites, sometimes at the kitchen table at midnight, with a cup of tea going cold beside me. Our son Grant Carmody was small during those years. He would sit beside me doing his homework, While I balanced the books, the two of us quiet together, the house smelling of whatever I had left in the slow cooker since morning. It was a good kind of quiet, the kind that comes from people who are comfortable, simply being in the same room. The company grew slowly at first, then faster. 1 truck became 3, 3 employees became 12. Residential contracts in the East End expanded to commercial properties downtown and out into Stony Creek. We moved from a rented townhouse to a house of our own, not large, but ours, with a proper backyard and a garage where Fred could store equipment over winter. I remember a September evening the year the company crossed $1 million in annual revenue for the first time. Fred came home early, which he almost never did, and brought flowers, which he did even less often. He sat down across from me at the kitchen table and put his hand over mine and said, "None of this happens without you. I need you to know that." I held on to that memory for a long time afterwards. Longer, I realize now, than was good for me. Success as a way of quietly rearranging a person's sense of what they owe and to whom, and Fred's rearrangement happened so gradually that I spent several years making excuses for what I was seeing before I admitted to myself what it actually was. It began with small things. New clothes? Nothing wrong with that. He'd worked hard and could afford them now. Better suits for client dinners. A country club membership in Ancaster. Networking events on weekday evenings that he attended alone. When I asked about it, the answer was always some version of the same thing. It was business. It was industry people. I probably wouldn't find it interesting. I had spent 20 years managing the finances of that industry. But apparently that didn't qualify me to sit at the same table. And then there was the name I started hearing more and more frequently. Petra Wolf. Fred had hired Petra Wolf 2 years earlier to manage the company's office. She was efficient, 38 years old, capable, and apparently always the person who had handled whatever needed to be handled. Fred mentioned her constantly in the way people mention someone they genuinely admire. Petra sorted the Calgary account. Petra reorganized the subcontractor files. Petra handled the dispute on the Eastgate property before it turned into something expensive. Every solved problem seemed to have Petra somewhere near the center of it. I told myself it was nothing. Managers praised competent employees. That was simply what happened when someone was good at their job. Then Fred's phone began spending a great deal of time face down on the counter. He started taking certain calls in other rooms. He came home from some evenings slightly too composed, in the careful way of someone who has thought about how they want to appear. Once I walked into the kitchen while he was mid-text exchange. He set the phone in his pocket quickly and said it was a client matter. It probably wasn't. There were other things. The way he occasionally looked at me at social events, not unkindly, but with a kind of mild, distracted embarrassment, as though I were a detail he hadn't accounted for. Comments about my clothes being a bit dated, about my hair, delivered gently, almost offhandedly, in the way of someone who believes they're being helpful. Each one small enough to dismiss. Together, over time, they added up to something that had a shape. The evening I want to describe slowly, because I have thought about it more than almost any other, was the night of Carmody Property Services' 25th anniversary dinner. Fred had booked the ballroom at the Royal Connaught. 200 guests, employees, long-standing clients, subcontractors, business associates, a few local counselors, people Fred called important connections. A sit-down dinner with a live band and custom-printed menus. The kind of event that earns a mention in the Hamilton Spectator's business section the following week. I spent the afternoon getting ready. I wore a deep green dress I had bought specifically for the occasion and had my hair done at the salon, on Lock Street. Yours. I'd been going to for 15 years. I put on my mother's pearl earrings. I was trying, I understand now, to look like a woman who still belonged in the room she was about to enter. Trying in the effortful way of someone who has already half-sensed she is being edged out of her own story. Fred barely looked at me when I came downstairs. In the car, he was on his phone the entire drive. I could tell by then the difference between his work expression and another one he wore sometimes. He smiled once at something on the screen. I looked out the window at the October streetlights and said nothing. The dinner was lovely, if you weren't watching the small things. I was seated at the head table, which gave me a clear view of the room, and, as it turned out, a clear view of where Fred's attention kept returning throughout the meal. Twice during the first course he checked his phone under the table. Petra Wolf was there, professionally dressed, seated 2 tables away with the office staff. I had expected to feel something sharp when I saw her. What I felt instead was something flatter and harder to name, as though I had already grieved something without quite knowing it yet. Then Fred gave his speech. He stood at the podium for nearly 20 minutes, and he was, I will give him this, a genuinely good speaker when it mattered to him. He thanked the clients. He thanked the crews. He thanked the office team. He thanked Petra Wolf by name twice with real warmth. He spoke about the journey from 1 truck and a bank loan and a lot of late nights to the company standing before them. He was funny in parts, sincere in others, and everyone applauded in the right places. He did not mention me. Not my name, not my wife, not a gesture toward family, not a word. 25 years of evenings at that kitchen table, of payroll runs and quarterly filings and loan guarantee documents signed with my hand, of Saturday mornings in my pajamas sorting invoices while Grant did his homework beside me. Nothing. I sat at the head table surrounded by 200 people and I was simply not there. I might have swallowed it if it had ended with the speech. But later, during the cocktail portion of the evening, I was standing near the bar when I heard Fred talking to one of his larger commercial clients, a man named Webb, who managed several warehouse properties in Stony Creek. Webb had apparently nodded in my direction and said something to the effect of, "Your wife must be proud of everything you've built here." Fred glanced briefly my way, then back at Webb and said, "Edith's always been supportive. She kept things running at home. That's its own contribution." Kept things running at home. I stood there holding my glass of sparkling water and understood, with a cold and specific clarity, exactly how the story had been rewritten. Not in one announcement, not in one conversation, but piece by piece across years, until even Fred believed the new version. Until I had become the woman who kept things running at home. Nothing more. Nothing that had happened between us at that kitchen table, all those late evenings, all that careful work. None of it had any weight in the story he was now telling. I got through the rest of the evening. I smiled. I thanked people. I drove home in silence. The divorce papers arrived 11 weeks later. I sat at our kitchen table, the same table, and read what Fred's lawyer had decided my 31 years amounted to. According to those documents, the business had been built through Frederick Carmody's individual enterprise and professional expertise. My role had been domestic in nature. I was entitled to a settlement that came to slightly less than a quarter of what we had built together. That word, domestic, sat on the page like a door being closed. I called my son Grant Carmody that same evening. Some part of me hoped that he would say, without my asking, that he knew what I had done, that he'd been there. He had been there. He had sat beside me at that table. Instead, Grant was careful. He said he hoped we could keep things civil. He said he didn't want to see both his parents destroy what they'd worked for. He used the word both, as though the question of who had worked for it were still open. My daughter-in-law Shauna Briggs was less careful when she called 2 days later. She didn't bother with careful at all. She said she hoped I wasn't planning to drag this through the courts because it wouldn't look good. She said, for either of us, which I didn't entirely understand at the time. That phrase stayed with me. The week after I received the papers, I went into our basement storage room with a flashlight and started working through filing boxes. 25 years of company records, neatly labeled because I had labeled them. I found the original loan documents in the 3rd box, 12 pages, my signature on every one of them, personal guarantee, financial disclosure, co-borrower agreement. Risk that Fred had not been willing to carry alone. I found bank statements from the early years with my own handwriting on the ledger sheets, clipped to the back. Seeing the pencil corrections where I'd caught errors felt like finding evidence that a person you'd been told didn't exist had, in fact, been there all along. Then I found the printout. An interview Fred had given to the Hamilton Spectator. I had never seen it. Published 22 years ago, the year the company first turned a real profit. The reporter had asked him what had made the difference, What had allowed a small Hamilton trades company to survive when so many didn't? Fred's answer, in his own quoted words. Honestly, my wife, Edith, manages the back end of this company with an attention to detail I never could replicate. I handle the clients and the crews. She handles everything that makes it possible to do that. Without her, we'd have gone under in year 3, easily. I read it 3 times. Then I placed it carefully in a separate folder and carried it upstairs. The call came from a number I didn't recognize on a Wednesday afternoon in November. I almost let it go to voicemail. Mrs. Carmody. I knew the voice. Morris Dubé, company accountant for 22 years, a precise, quiet man from Sudbury who had settled in Hamilton in his 30s and never left. I've been thinking about whether to make this call for a while now, he said. I've decided I should. We met 2 days later at a coffee shop on James Street North. Morris arrived before me. He had a large black coffee in front of him and a manila envelope on the table that he didn't touch when I sat down. He said he was going to tell me some things and that he wanted me to understand he was not doing it lightly. He had worked for Fred for 22 years. He said that in those 22 years, he had watched what happened to the financial records of Carmody Property Services change slowly, carefully, and in ways that required knowing exactly what you were looking for before you could see them. He said that, over the past 18 months, certain company assets had been redirected through arrangements that a proper forensic audit would find very difficult to justify. He pushed the envelope across the table. I asked him first about Petra Wolf. Morris looked up. What about her? He said. I told him what I had suspected for the better part of 2 years. What people had apparently been whispering about, based on the way certain conversations shifted when I walked into rooms at company events. The late messages. The face-down phone. Morris shook his head slowly. Petra is a good office manager, he said. That's the whole of it. She's been managing rumors about herself for 2 years, with no way to correct them without making things worse. Fred never set anyone straight. A pause. It was convenient for him that people were looking in her direction. The coffee shop felt smaller. Because if it wasn't Petra, there was another name. And whoever that name belonged to had been protected behind the wrong assumption for 2 years, while I pointed my grief at the wrong person entirely. Morris opened the envelope and removed several printed documents, a small flash drive, and a handwritten chronology of dates. He said there were financial transfers he had traced, not easily, to accounts connected to a woman named Diana Keene. The name was not unfamiliar. Diana Keene sat on the boards of 2 Hamilton business associations and appeared regularly in the Spectator's business coverage. She was well-regarded, well-connected, the kind of woman people in Fred's circles called formidable. I had met her at events perhaps 3 times over the years. She had always been entirely pleasant to me. I asked Morris how long. From what he had been able to document, he said, at least 4 years. He also had recordings from 3 office meetings in the past year. He had begun keeping his own phone recording during certain conversations, after he'd raised questions about the accounting and received responses that made him deeply uneasy. In one recording, Fred was speaking to someone on speakerphone, voice relaxed, fully confident, the tone of a man who does not believe the ground can move beneath him. Morris pressed play, the office sounds, the papers shuffling, and then Fred's voice clear and unhurried. The judge isn't going to take a 63-year-old bookkeeper's word over mine. She kept the books for 6 years, and then I brought in professionals. That's not a business partner. That's a favor I did her. I sat there with my hands around a coffee I hadn't touched, and I looked out the window at James Street and the November gray of it, and I understood something that I had been circling for months without being able to quite say it aloud. Fred had not simply grown careless about what I meant to him. He had decided, at some point, that I had never mattered at all, and he had believed that version of events thoroughly enough to say it in a room full of colleagues without any hesitation. Morris and I talked for 2 hours. Before we left, he said something I have thought about many times since. He said he had been at the anniversary dinner. He had heard the speech. He had watched me sit at that head table. I've been doing these books since you were still doing them yourself at your kitchen table, he said. I know what the company looked like before you organized it, and I know what it looked like after. Watching that speech felt wrong. I should have called you sooner than this. My lawyer, Andrea Tom, reviewed everything Morris had provided and within 48 hours had formally requested a forensic accounting review of the company's full financial history. The objection from Fred's legal team arrived quickly. Its speed told us most of what we needed to know about what the review would find. Fred himself remained publicly composed throughout the pre-trial period. He moved through it the way he moved through most things, contained, certain, carrying the particular confidence of someone who has not yet understood that the ground has shifted under him. And then Morris Dubé walked through the door. When Andrea called Morris to testify, he answered every question with the organized care of a man who has been arranging his thoughts for a long time before being given the opportunity to say them properly. He described the irregularities. He described the transfers, the accounts, the documented patterns. He described the recording. Fred's lawyer objected to the recordings. The objection was reviewed and denied. The room was very quiet while the first recording played. Fred's voice carried easily in the courtroom acoustics, relaxed and unhurried. The judge isn't going to take a 63-year-old bookkeeper's word over mine. No one moved for a moment after it ended. Then Andrea introduced the spectator interview. She handed copies to the bench and to opposing counsel and read the relevant passage aloud without editorial. Fred's own assessment of what had built the company. My name, my work. His signature under it, in a sense. His words, in print, from 22 years ago, when he still remembered what was true. I did not look at Fred while she read it. I didn't need to. When the Diana Keene entered the formal record of the proceedings, Morris testified to the transfers and the documented financial connections with the same careful precision he had brought to everything else. And as the picture formed in that courtroom, I saw something unexpected in the gallery. My daughter-in-law Shauna Briggs, who had been seated beside my son Grant Carmody, went very still. Andrea had been given records placing Shauna at 2 of Diana Keene's private business gatherings over the past 3 years, events that appeared on no professional calendar, connected only to Diana's personal circle. Not Fred's business associates, not industry contacts, Shauna. Grant turned to look at his wife. I watched my son's face in that moment. I had been prepared for many things coming into that courtroom. I had not been prepared for the particular expression I saw on Grant's face then. Not guilt at being caught in something, but the specific devastation of someone realizing that the story they believed they were living inside was not the story that had actually been happening. He hadn't known this part. Whatever he'd looked away from before, he hadn't known this. That hurt me in a way I had not prepared for. Different from Fred's betrayal. A different kind of entirely. The ruling came 4 weeks later. The judge found that the financial contributions to Carmody Property Services during the marriage, the personal loan guarantee, the years of documented administrative and operational support, the financial infrastructure of the company's early period represented a substantial shared investment in everything the company had become. She found that the asset disclosures filed by Frederick Carmody's legal team were materially incomplete. She found in favor of a significantly revised division of the marital estate. She also referred the matter of the financial irregularities to the appropriate provincial authorities for further review. As people were filing out of the courtroom afterwards, Fred found me in the corridor. He looked older than he had at the beginning of all this. Composed still, jacket straight, posture correct. But something behind his eyes was quiet in a way that wasn't peace, more like a room where the furniture had been taken out. He said, "You didn't have to go this far." I looked at him for a moment. 31 years between us in that corridor. The fall fair in Dundas, the kitchen table, the loan, the anniversary speech, all of it. I said, "Fred, I didn't go anywhere. I simply stopped letting you go without me." He had no answer for that. After a moment, he turned and walked toward the exit, and I let him go without calling after him. Grant called me 3 weeks later. He asked if we could meet at the park along the waterfront near my new apartment. He came alone on a bright February afternoon, cold enough that we could see our breath. He looked as though he hadn't been sleeping well for some time. He said he was sorry. He said it more than once and in more than one way, which told me he meant it. He said he had known more than he'd told me. Not everything, but enough. He had been afraid of losing his father's regard. He had told himself that staying neutral was the same as staying out of it, and he understood now that it wasn't. I told him I understood being afraid. I also told him, clearly and without softening it, what that silence had cost me during the months when I needed someone who already knew the truth to say so. We sat on a bench overlooking the lake for a long time. By the time we walked back to the parking lot, something between us had shifted. Not repaired, that was going to take longer than one afternoon, but shifted. Moving, at least, in the direction of something better. Morris Dubé eventually left the company. He does independent accounting work now, small businesses mostly, people who need someone careful and thorough. I send him a card every Christmas. He always sends one back. What I did with the settlement was quieter than some people expected. I sold the house in the East End, too large, too many complicated rooms, and moved into an apartment on the escarpment with good light in the mornings and a view of the city I have lived in my whole life. I enrolled in the Human Resources Management Certificate program at Mohawk College, the same program I had set aside 30 years ago when the company's first filing season turned out to need more than Fred alone could manage. I completed it in 14 months. I now consult part-time for 2 small businesses in Hamilton that need the kind of careful, experienced administrative support that is, as it turns out, considerably harder to find than most people expect. Someone asked me recently what I had learned from all of it. She was a woman I had met in one of my courses, close to my age, working through her own version of a late start. I took longer to answer than she probably expected. I said, "Don't let yourself disappear quietly into someone else's account of your own life. Not because your contributions will always be recognized. Sometimes they won't, and you have to make your peace with that. But because the documents were never the point. Not really. The point was that I knew. Before the folders, before Morris, before the courtroom, I knew what I had done and what it had meant. No one had that from me, not even Fred. Your value does not require someone else's confirmation to be real. It is real because you lived it." 31 years ago, I sat across a kitchen table from a man with a notebook full of plans, and I thought, yes, this is worth building a life with. I still believe that was true once. I think he was that person once. What I carry forward now is this: people can change in ways that are very quiet, very slow, and very difficult to see from inside them. And the truth doesn't disappear just because someone has decided it's inconvenient. It waits. It sits in filing boxes in basements. It lives in old newspaper interviews. It walks through courtroom doors in the hands of a quiet man from Sudbury who decided, after 22 years, that some things were simply worth saying out loud. I am grateful every day that Morris Dubé made that call. And I hope, wherever you are watching from today, that when your moment comes, the moment when speaking costs something and staying quiet would be so much easier. I hope you make the call too.